Hello and welcome. For today's lesson, I want to take a look at something that's a common problem for my students, something that they ask about a lot, and something that, to be honest, as a teacher can be quite difficult to answer. We're talking about possession and different ways of explaining relationships of possession in English, when to use of, when to use an apostrophe S, and when to use a compound noun. Let's take a look. We're going to see in this lesson some examples of 3 different ways of showing relationships of possession. We're going to try to identify the rules about when to use each one as best we can. Now, these are not a perfect set of rules and there are some exceptions. What I really want students to take away from this is maybe how to avoid getting it wrong in your writing and speaking. You'll see that sometimes both things are possible. Sometimes you might use an apostrophe S or you might use an of. There are 2 possibilities. We'll see that it's a little bit easier to tell you some general rules and maybe a little bit what not to do than to tell you exactly what is correct. A little note before we start. Like so many others, this is one of those areas of language that is difficult to describe perfectly. While we can make some general comments, there are a few fixed rules to follow. Sometimes the answer will be, unfortunately, because it sounds better. And it is often easier to tell students what not to say than what to say. But with that in mind, let's do our best to describe when to use of, when to use apostrophe S, and when to use a compound noun. Let's start with a question. It's always good to start with a question. I've put the title here, What a Mess, and it is a mess. This is especially if in your native language, if in your mother tongue, you only have one way of saying this. You have something like the of construction, something of something. It's a little bit confusing that in English we have 3 different ways of representing this. For example, why do we say John's dog is cute, but not the dog of John is cute? Why can we drink a cup of coffee from a coffee cup? And how are chicken wings different from chicken's wings? To try to answer these questions, we'll start by looking at a few different people and things that have other people and things. So we've got the verb have in the middle, and let's look at some of the people and things that can have other things. So we've got my brother, that guitar, the table, the government, and a chicken. Chickens will come back again in this lesson, and you'll see why, because they make for some interesting examples. But let's give these people some things. So now let's look at the things that they have. My brother has a house. True story. That guitar has some strings. It wouldn't sound very good without them. The table has a height. Now, clearly the verb to have here is doing a slightly different job. The table has a height. Well, it does, but not in the same way as my brother has a house. The verb is kind of doing something different here, isn't it? The government has a policy, and a chicken has wings. Okay. If we put a circle around all of these things on the left, all of the havers, if you like, we can call these in general the possessors for the moment. And if we put a circle around all of the things on the right, all of the things that are had, we'll call these the possessed for the moment. But that relationship of possession is an interesting one, because in some of these cases, we really are talking about possessions, things that belong to a person or belong to an organization, things that are ours, that we own. But some of them, we're talking about a different kind of relationship. Let's look at them one by one. My brother has a house. I think that's a very clear example that is a possession. The house belongs to my brother. My brother owns the house. Okay, we're talking about a possession. What about that guitar has some strings? Is that a relationship of possession? I'm going to say that it's not really. We're talking about here a part of the guitar. I put the question mark because it's not a permanent part of the guitar. You can change the strings. You can take the strings off the guitar and it's still a guitar. You can't really use it. But I think the best word here to use is a part. The next one, the table has a height. That's not a possession or a part. The height is not a part of the table, but it is a characteristic of the table. The government has a policy. Is the policy a possession of the government? Maybe in some sense it is, but clearly not in the same way as my brother has a house is a relationship of possession. And the chicken has wings. Well, no, clearly here we're talking about the wings being a part of the chicken. Okay. So what we know so far, let's summarize that. What we've established so far is that there are different ways of having something. The verb have can do some different jobs, some different functions. People and things can have possessions, but we can also have parts, features, characteristics, relationships, functions, etc. Now, if we take here the items from the left-hand side of our table, the havers, the possessors, which of them can really be said to have possessions in the way that I can have a notebook or I can have a pen? Well, I think clearly people can have possessions. My brother has a house, he owns the house, it belongs to him, etc. The government can have possessions. Maybe we would argue that really they're the possessions of the people, they belong to all of us, but I think for the purpose of language and grammar, we can say that a government can have possessions. A chicken can have possessions. It's difficult to see with a chicken, but animals can have possessions. You can think of maybe your dog that has a toy, or your cat has a scratching post or something like that. I think animals can have possessions. And then the other two, I think it's fairly clear that they don't have possessions in the same way as people have possessions. More generally, we can identify a few categories of things or of people that can have possessions. So a person, clearly, yes. A city, country, or other place can have possessions. A government can have possessions. An animal, to a lesser extent, but yes, can have possessions as well. A company can have possessions, or any kind of organization, team, or group of people can have possessions. So what does that mean for our question of apostrophe S or of or compound nouns? Well, what it means is that with all of these categories that can be said to have possessions, it's generally pretty safe to use this apostrophe S structure. So for a person, we might have John's bike. For a city, country, or other place, we might talk about Scotland's castles. For a government, we might talk about the Spanish government's policy on blah, blah, blah. For an animal, we might be talking about the dog's toy. For a company, we might be talking about something like Apple's marketing strategy, or we might be talking about Barca's manager. Now, clearly, all of these possessors are capable of having possessions, but not all of the examples that I've put on the screen here are examples of possessions. If you follow me, so John's bike is a material possession that John has. The dog's toy is a material possession that the dog has. But Apple's marketing strategy is not really a possession of Apple. What that means is that for our possessors, as well as possessions, we can use the apostrophe S with their parts, relations, qualities, characteristics, other abstract nouns. That means we can say John's bike as a material possession, but also John's leg, John's mum as a relation, John's intelligence as a quality, John's height as a characteristic, John's problems, to give an example of an abstract noun. Let's add this to our summary. For possessors that are people, animals, places, and organizations, we tend to use apostrophe S. If you only take away one thing, let it be that. Okay. There are exceptions. For example, we say France's borders are closed, but the mayor of Paris has announced. We probably wouldn't usually say Paris's mayor. We tend to say the mayor of Paris. But let's consider that an exception and let's put it away for the moment. Let's not let it get in the way of our nice, neat rules. In general, for possessors that are people, animals, places and organisations, we tend to use apostrophe S. So when then do we use the of version? To be clear, in many of the cases where we can use apostrophe S, we can also use of. This is true if it's especially if it's in more formal language, and also in titles. So we have things like the Return of the Jedi. It's not the Jedi's return, it's the Return of the Jedi. Similarly, the Silence of the Lambs or the Call of the Wild. In titles of movies, books, etc., it's more common to use the of structure. And this is especially true when we're talking about things that are not literally possessions. To take two examples here, the Spanish government's policy or the policy of the Spanish government. To me, they sound both equally correct, although you might find the of version more frequently in formal language. Note that it is pretty unusual to use of with people. So we tend to say John's mum, and it sounds pretty strange to say the mum of John. You'd be, in my opinion, unlikely to ever hear that from the mouth of a native speaker, at least. Another use of is for all the nouns that were not on our possessors list. So the ones that are not animals, organisations, groups of people, companies, etc. That typically means inanimate objects like a table, a chair, a computer, and it also means abstract nouns. And this is true whether we're talking about their parts, their characteristics, their features, their functions, or whatever. So the walls of the house, the height of the table, the nature of the problem, or the level of the exam, for example. For some of these, you could use apostrophe S. If you're a native speaker of English watching this, you're probably saying, oh, wait, some of these don't sound so bad with apostrophe S. That's true. But as native speakers, we really depend on our intuition and what sounds better to differentiate between them. I think for learners of English, it's probably safer for these inanimate objects and abstract nouns, for things that are not people, organisations, groups of people, animals, etc., it's safer to use the of version. We also use of for measures and for vessels and their contents. So we say a litre of water, 2 metres of string, a glass of whiskey, etc. And let's add that into our summary then. So for other types of possessors, inanimate objects, abstract nouns, etc., it's probably safer to use of. And that brings us to the last part about compound nouns. We often use compound nouns to talk about types of things. So guitar strings, for example, are a type of strings. A bike chain is a type of chain. A coffee cup is a type of cup. Chicken wings, then, are a type of wings. I'm not sure that that's a very satisfactory answer. I'm not completely convinced by that. Let's see if there's another explanation as well. I would add this extra explanation, this extra sentence, that compound nouns are also often formed when words appear together frequently, or when we perceive them as being one thing and not as a part of something else. What I mean by that is that a chicken's wings, we're talking about a part of the anatomy of a chicken in the same way as we talk about a person's arm, the boy's head, or whatever. When we think of chicken wings as a food item, we kind of perceive it a little bit differently. We're thinking of it as one single item and not really a part of the animal in the same way. So if we add our explanation of compound nouns into our summary, we see that compound nouns like coffee cup, guitar strings, bus stop, keyboard are often types of things. but compound nouns may often just be formed through words being used together frequently. As an extra bonus, I'm sorry I said that we were coming to the end, but there's one more little thing. It's important to know that we use apostrophe S with expressions of time for some strange reason. For example, we say things like, have you seen today's newspaper? We would never say the newspaper of today. It's just not right. It's today's newspaper. It's only a few hours' drive from here. We use a possessive apostrophe S to explain that. In this case, of course, the apostrophe comes after the S because it's after a plural ending in S. Or I'm going to Portugal for a fortnight's holiday, a fortnight being 2 weeks. In all of these cases, this is really the only correct way to say it. It sounds pretty weird and pretty bad to use of in any of these. Okay, so we'll add that in as the last little point on our summary, that we use apostrophe S with time expressions. And that concludes the explanation part of this lesson. What I'd like to do now is to hand over to you. We'll go back to these questions that we started with, and hopefully, maybe you need to watch part of the video again or to read part of the explanation again, but hopefully now you can explain the difference between these. You can answer these questions. Why do we say John's dog is cute and not the dog of John? Why do we drink a cup of coffee from a coffee cup? And how are chicken wings different from chicken's wings? I'll leave that on the screen a moment for you to think about. If you want to leave your answers in the comments, then please do, and I'll take a look at them. And I'll also put my answers on the screen in a moment. If you want to pause to write your answer, you can do that now. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that's helped to explain the topic of possession and when to use apostrophe S, when to use of, and when we use compound nouns. And I hope to see you again in another lesson.